Okay, let's turn to chapter 19 in Exodus. And as we've been going, we've not read every word of all of these texts because of the time limitations that we have. But I think we can follow along individually as we go, and we'll pick up some of the reading. This chapter 19 is setting up for God to give his law to the people. And so that's what we want to notice as we go. I want to hark you back to a slide that we used the very first of our study of Exodus and ask you to remember this as you think about the giving of the law. The real purposes of Exodus were to establish and maintain faith in Jehovah through a God-centered description of the events that are there, and then to set forth the divine directives and judgments concerning spiritual values and moral and ethical imperatives. So we said all of that. The first half of this book deals with the coming out of the people from the bondage down in Egypt. And the purposes of all of those miracles that God performed, all of those instructions he gave us concerning that part of their movement were to make sure that they had their relationship with God in place. And then he could give the law. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. But it depended first upon their recognition of his role in their lives and his rights to give them the law. See, he had to establish first his right to give the law. And he's going to say that right before he gives it. And then now this second half of the book is going to deal with the laws that he gives, the directives, the moral and ethical values that he sets forth that they're supposed to follow, you see. So this book kind of is in two parts. The first part, the Exodus itself under Moses, and then the second part, the law that is given, that is identified all through the Bible from here on as the law of Moses, the law given to Moses. It was God's law. So don't misunderstand when you repeat that phrase, the law of Moses. It was the law of God given through Moses that we want to be cognizant of. Okay, now we talked about the coming out from Egypt, and if you'll look at the first 2 or 3 verses of chapter 19, they're going to be about 3 months from Ramses in Egypt to Horeb or Mount Sinai at the mountain, where they encamp before the mountain, where God is going to appear, come down, he says. The text, if you kind of glance down the text, it's going to say he came down. So let's look at this. Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel." That's verse 3. And what he's going to do now is established first before he gives these specific instructions or specific laws or guidelines for life. He's going to establish his covenant with them. So he says, "You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine." That's the center of the covenant, is the relationship that they have with each other. Israel would be a special people to God. He would be especially recognizing their role among humanity, and they would then have him as their God. So it would be a covenant between the two of them. "You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Do you recognize that from any New Testament application? Anybody? Peter, 1 Peter, talks in those same terms, doesn't it, about us today. "These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel." So, notice this covenant is remembering the promises to Abraham, in which God said he would make them a great people, he would make them a great nation, and he would give them land. So all of this is focused toward the fulfillment of promises that they had been given all the way back to Genesis chapter 12. Okay? Got it? Ooh. Let me hit the right button here. There we go. All right, now, Moses delivered the message about the covenant, that which we have just read. And the people responded. And they say, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." So at this point, they're going to accept the covenant, agree to the covenant from their end, just as God has stated it from his end on this. All that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Did they do that? Not always. Not always. Now, as we said, God says to them, "On the third day I will come down on Mount Sinai." Notice he says, "I will come down," which is interesting phraseology, because it signifies he's going to be with the people. He's going to be with his people, that he'll be a part of his people. He'll come down. Now, does he literally come out of heaven? Well, it's hard to say how to define that. You have to define that term, don't you, when you're talking about this. But I think he is saying, in a very special way, I'm going to manifest myself to my people. And he's going to do that. Notice there are 3 times in the text, twice here in chapter 19, verse 11 and verse 20, where he says, "I will come down." And then over in chapter 20, at verse 20, he had come down after giving the law. See, that's what he had come to do. So he says, "I will come down on Mount Sinai." The people are to stand back. they were very afraid. I think we would all be afraid too. And is there a description of this in the New Testament too? I want to kind of keep some of these statements before us because Ray is studying with us Hebrews, and you want to relate our study in Sunday morning to his study on Wednesday night is what we're trying to do as we go along. So, is this referenced, this matter of the mountain and the people being afraid, anywhere in Hebrews? We haven't gotten there yet, Ray. Chapter 12 is where it is. And see, he says, we have not come to a mountain that shook, a mountain where the smoke was, where the people were afraid and all of this. We have not come to that mountain, but we have come to Mount Zion, which is the church of the Lord. He's going to say, the firstborn of those in Christ, really. Okay? All right. So the mountain was engulfed in fire and smoke. It quaked. There was the blast of a trumpet. Does that signal anything to you? Where do you think of that happening? What? They were to called to worship there. Any other? Yeah, we think of the coming of Christ and the judgment, don't we? In relation to the sound of a trumpet. Didn't Paul say something about that in 1 Thessalonians 4? About the Lord's coming with the sound of the trumpet and the voice of God. Do you see why the people were afraid? Yeah, I think that's going to strike a fear in everyone when that first takes place. All right, so Moses was to go up and Aaron was to go up with him into the mountain. And Jehovah was going to come down to them. And he came in these actions, these evidences of his presence. Okay? Now, this law, when we come to chapter 20, the law was to help them. The law was not to condemn them. The law was to be a schoolmaster, to bring them to Christ. It had purposes that were intended to organize the nation. You need laws to provide for order and arrangement. And so that's what these were to do, and we see that as we go. The law was to restrict in the sense of helping people to know the boundaries. The law of Moses was to give the boundaries to the people of what was right, what God expected. It was not to be, when we think of the law of Moses, we think laws, restrictions, hardships brought by, it was not intended to bring hardship to the people. It was intended to help the people. And the gospel is like that. The gospel provides boundaries in our relationship with Christ, doesn't it? And the law of Moses was to do that. Now, when you look at the law, I think it is important to understand how God sees it. God's laws come out of His character and His ethical nature. So they're not just something He devised, sitting up here saying, now, how can I cow these people down? How can I make them like little robots? He's trying to get His people to be the kind of people He is. And each of these laws is directed in that vein as we go. He doesn't ask us to sacrifice our children or mutilate our bodies like the pagans, you see. It's going to be very, very different kind of society, a different kind of order than the nations, the tribes that were in Canaan were presently operating under, you see. So you want to be sure you understand what God is going to ask the people to do, and what the law of Moses is really designed to do is to be ethical, to bring these people to an ethical set of standards that everybody could live by. Nobody did. The fact that nobody did, we come back and say, God is telling them something that they can't do. Well, they could do. In any given case, they could be ethical. They could obey the law. We can obey the law. We don't obey the law, is what happens. And every human being except Jesus Christ has broken the law. Not necessarily this law, God's law generally. We have sinned. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. But we could do right. And God's laws are not outside the bounds of our ability to do right. You don't have to kill somebody. You can keep the Sabbath. You don't have to steal. You don't have to lie. You see? You can control your mind. You don't have to covet. You see what I'm saying? So God doesn't ask us to do these abominable things. He's going to call some of the things that the nations in Israel, the Jebusites and the Moabites and the Edomites, and what they following their gods, he's going to call those things abomination. I'm sure they must have had some conscience regarding what they were doing, but it was an abomination, what they were doing. Okay? So what God is going to ask people to do in the law of Moses is to be good. Be good people. Have a good society. And do what God wants to do. Included, of course, in that is going to be the religious, spiritual elements that are in His relationship with Him as we go. Okay? Any question about any of that? Does that make sense, what we're saying there? Okay, so the law was based on reciprocal, obligatory relationship with God. What does reciprocal mean? And what? Give and take, okay? Goes both ways. God will keep his end of the thing, you keep your end. You see, reciprocal. What's obligatory? You have to do it. In order for this to work, it has to be required that we do this, you see. So there's going to have to be, as we go along, some penalties associated with the violation of these things. If the people say, we will do it, and God says, this is what you do, they say, we will do it, then that's it. See, this is not going to be a black and white, a gray area kind of law that God gives. It's going to be required. We do this, you see. All right? So, it all comes back to your relationship with God, whether you accept it or not, you see. So actually, it was intended to elevate man above all other creatures, all other societies, all other peoples, as they were before God. So I've asked that little question. What if everybody observed the laws? Always. Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Wow, she says. Wow. If everybody obeyed the law, if everybody accepted Christ and lived like Christ would, the law is to set those boundaries so we know about that. Okay? I don't know what those stones look like. Some have pictured them this way. I doubt they had Roman numerals. Okay, here are the 10 Commandments. The first 4 are specifically related to God. You shall have no other gods before me. That's first. You shall not make a carved image. So idolatry is out, you see. Not only do you not recognize any other God, but you don't make an image of God. You don't even make an image of the true God, which we'll see in a minute. You shall not take the name of the Lord in vain, and remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. It's a worship day, a day designed for special relationship with God during the week, one day a week. Okay? Now, the 5th commandment is kind of interesting to me, how it is categorized. It's very important. Honor your father and your mother, to take care of one another. We'll go through these again in a minute. Some relate number 5 with the first 4. And I tend to do that a little bit myself because the way that law is written puts the parents in the middle between God and the person. The parents are to be the conduit to teach the children what God wants them to do and to bring them to relationship with God, you see. So it may be a kind of the positioning of it in Moses' writing here and God's giving the law may be important as either a transition or a kind of a final statement on what part of this law is related to God. You see what I'm saying? Am I making sense to you? And I'd like for you to get that point. Okay, then these next ones are related specifically socially to your relationship with other human beings. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie, don't covet. Those are the in your relationship with each other, you see. So, in Matthew 22, when this young ruler is asked, what are the great commandments? They must have been taught. You love God, that's the first half. You love your fellow men, your neighbor, that's the second half. And he must have been thinking somewhat about the Ten Commandments. What's the greatest commandment? Well, love God and love your neighbor. You see? And that goes back to the very beginning statement of it all, doesn't it? Okay? Y'all with me? All right. So let's notice now a couple of things. The Ten Commandments are absolutes. Don't do this, or do this. They're not given as maybe sometimes you do this, or maybe sometimes it's okay to lie, or steal, or maybe it's sometimes okay not to remember the Sabbath day. You see, he just says, do it. Do this. This is the law. There are three kinds of sins that actually fall into a category for which a person should allow himself to die if he violates them, or be executed for doing that. Murder is one, idolatry is one, and forbidden sexual relationships are. And I could look at the capital punishment laws specifically. We'll probably do that next week or the next week as we look at the specific laws as they are set down. So we'll save that. But I just wanted to tell you up front, at least some of these laws are punishable by capital punishment. And you'll see times where the people are a little confused about what they should do about something, and they take it to God, and God says, take him out of the camp. Tough penalties. But these are strong boundaries. See, you need the boundaries. Okay, any question about that? Anybody want to comment on that? All right. The broadened law, I think we mentioned once before that the law is going to be given here at Mount Sinai to start with. And the Ten Commandments are kind of the preamble. And then we have a couple of, about 4 chapters, I think, of these personal laws and how that they affected the people, laws concerning the people. We're going to have a few chapters on that coming up. And then the law is given later at Moab, and it's before the Moab, and then when they go into the land. So there are really 3 occasions where the law of Moses is given out altogether. So by the time of Christ, the rabbis were saying the whole law contained 613 total precepts and principles. And they said there were 248 positive laws corresponding to the number of bones and organs and other parts of the human body, that some of them would even go so far as to try to delineate that. And then 365 negatives corresponding to the days in a year. So that's kind of just interesting how some of them thought about some of these things. The Bible doesn't really do that. All right? So let's look at the commandments now. Before he states commandment number one. Number one is going to be, you shall have no other gods before me. But notice in your text now, you can read, he says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. See, he says that first. Remember, a few minutes ago we said that the law has to be given by one with authority and one who has the right to give it. And if the people come back when he gives these 10 commandments and they say, well, who are you to tell us what to do like this? You know, people do that sometimes, don't they? Who are you to tell us? God says, look, I am the Lord your God. And I brought you out of Egypt, and I have the right to do this, or you'd still be down there under oppression. Actually, if it weren't for the Lord, they wouldn't have been there to start with, because they'd have been all dead before then. Do you see that? So, I don't have too much problem. In fact, I really don't have any problem with parents saying to their children, I'm your mother. I said it. That's it. In fact, and I said this to one or two of you the other night, something came up about this in another kind of lesson, a different thing altogether. It may be that the most important lesson you teach to your children, aside from believe in God, is authority. Who has authority? Who has the right to say? It may be that the most important thing you tell your children, once in a while at least, I'm not saying every time, is, I'm your daddy. I'm your mama. You do this because Dad said to. And besides all that, the child is to have respect for you and to love you and to want to respond to you. You want to work your relationship so that that will be true. So you don't have to say, well, so you don't have to hear them say, why should I do this, or why, or who. You get what I'm saying here? Yes. Yeah, yeah. Well, I think my point is, I'm not totally in line with Dr. Spock, or I guess we don't even know who he is anymore, who would say, don't ever say to your children, it's just because you say it. Sometimes you need to say, it's because I say it. And Dad knows better than I do. And God knows better than the Israelites did. That's the point, you see. And he's making that point. I am the Lord your God. So do this. Make sense? Are we to do that? Have no other gods before him? Yes, we are. Now, this commandment is brought over into the New Testament because it is what it is. Paul said, for us, there is one God, the Father, of whom are all things, and we for him, that we were made for him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, all spiritual blessings, and all salvation, and through whom we live spiritually. You see. So why do we serve God? Because he saved us. He made us and he saved us. That's it. So we're not under the law as the law, but we are under the sentiment of the law, the same in the gospel as we were. Okay? Commandment number 2, you shall not make yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above. Who's in heaven? God is, so you don't make an image of me even. Or that is in the earth beneath, or that's in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them nor serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. So, don't make any idolatry. Idolatry is condemnable, abominable to God. All idolatry. Okay? Why would you not make an image of him, of God himself? It is unnecessary, certainly, yeah. Huh? God is spirit. Anything you make to look like him and give that suggestion to the mind of somebody degrades him because it brings him down to a physical kind of thing. You see? Anything you can imagine to picture God in your mind or in your heart brings him down to our level. He's God. You've got to leave him spirit. God is spirit. You worship him in spirit and truth. You see that? So you don't do that. You don't make an image of even the true God. Because you do that, you lower him in your mind. Okay? Did we miss one? Yes, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. For the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Did you all ever sass your mother or your dad? What does that indicate? Disrespect. So you take God's name in vain, what do? You show disrespect for him, don't you? Should we do that? Never, never. Not even when you get mad because you didn't make the play or they didn't deal with you right on the football field, not at the gas station, not anywhere. You don't take God's name in vain. We need to watch how we use certain terms that the world uses to refer to God. Why? Because that shows disrespect. So you don't bring him down to your level with an idol or an image or an icon of some kind, and you don't sass him. You don't say his name in vain. You see that? So, we are told not to swear using even God's name. Okay? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Now, this is the one that kind of sometimes makes us disregard the whole matter of the Ten Commandments and say we don't have to do that because we're not under the law. And that's true. We're not under the law of Moses. We do not observe these things. But let me ask you, do we need some holy time in our lives? What's God trying to do here? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. There was one day where those people put aside the earthly stuff, the work, the labor, the travel, the other stuff they did. They put that aside and they worshiped God and they kept holy this day. They went to synagogue in Jesus' day on the Sabbath day. That's where he knew the people were going to be and where he sometimes kind of got in trouble with them, at least, for certain things he said and did on the Sabbath day in the synagogues. But they were to go to those places. They were to keep the Sabbath day holy, weren't they? And I'm just saying, we might take a lesson from the Ten Commandments to keep one day, especially where we focus to God. And I think we try to do that. Yes? Okay, I think I can agree with that. I think certain things that are activities that are required of us, we do. And you would admit that, sure. Okay, we better hurry on here. We'll talk about the Sabbath and the days, what the Sabbath is about before we get through with Exodus here. We'll talk about the role the Sabbath played in things. That's coming up in our study. Okay, then honor your father and your mother. And that means, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. When Paul says this in Ephesians 6, I think we ought to think of responsible children, children old enough to be responsive to their parents. And the reason I say that, I don't think we're talking about little children necessarily here. Paul isn't. He says, obey your parents in the Lord. In the Lord is a phrase that was most often used by Paul to refer to Christians who had obeyed the Lord, recognize who the Lord is, and obey his commands. They do it, the children are to do this because it is right to do this, you see. Not because I'll get a spanking if I don't, because this is right. You see what I'm saying? So it looks like Paul is talking to children who are ready to at least respond to the Lord in some ways. Okay? We can think about that. So, don't murder. Paul talks about these things that are worthy of death in the book of Romans in chapter 1. You got that? So you shall not murder. Remember, we said a while ago, love your neighbor as yourself. You don't love your neighbor if you kill him, do you? So you violated the very essence of what the law is all about if you kill, if you commit adultery, you see. If you commit adultery, you don't really, you say, well, I love her. So no, you don't make a person an adulteress if you love them. You don't make a person a fornicator if you're in love with them. Remember that. That's a violation in itself. Don't steal. See, you don't love your neighbor if you take his stuff. Do you? You see the point? Don't bear false witness. If you lie about your neighbor and get him in trouble, you don't love him if you do that. And if you covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet his wife, his servant, his ox, his donkey, or anything that he has. You see, you're happy for him to have his things. Love your neighbor. Love your neighbor. That's what that is. What? Yeah, I haven't done that either. Okay. You might covet their puppy or their something like that. Huh? Their fancy car. Yeah. But don't covet. Don't have that kind of heart and spirit, I think, is what he's saying. Okay, well, we got to stop there. That gives us an idea of the movement toward the second half of the book of Exodus. Okay? All right.